And so it is my pleasure today to introduce you to one of our board members from the Denver office, Richard Lewis. And even though that job as director sounded like a really big job, he actually has another job that occupies him full time. He has his own business called RTL, and he will talk about that, I'm sure, at some point in terms of the work he does. But it is my pleasure to introduce Richard, and I'll turn the program over to you now.
Thank you for that introduction, Esther, and for your words. And I also appreciate all the hospitality and professionalism that's always extended by the Kansas City Federal Reserve whenever I'm here, as well as the branches. As Esther mentioned, Richard Lewis, I'm the president, CEO, and founder of a company called RTL Networks. We're a multi-million-dollar firm, 10-year anniversary this year, and happy to say that for 5 of the 10 years that we've been in existence, we've been recognized by Inc. magazine as one of the fastest growing in the country, either one of the fastest 5,000 or fastest 500 growing firms, excuse me, private firms in the country. But I want to take it back a little bit. I want to take it back before RTL Networks. I want to go back before some of my time in corporate America, where I worked for Cisco Systems, Avaya, and what is now CenturyLink. And I want to go back to 1993. 1993, I was a newly promoted captain in the United States Air Force. Let's see if I can do this. There you go, there's me. I was 4 years out of college and 26 years old, and Operation Desert Storm had just concluded, and it was immediately followed by Operation Southern Watch. And I was supporting Operation Southern Watch. I was assigned to the United States Military Training Mission at the Royal Saudi Air Force Headquarters in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And I was a communications officer, and I was responsible for all critical computer applications used throughout the theater of operations, which that theater it included the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia itself, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and all Navy flying assets, and essentially that's the aircraft carriers. So this role required me to travel quite a bit to the various military bases in the theater, as well as to the aircraft carriers, to install and update critical IT systems that were used to generate and disseminate the daily flight missions and instructions, or as we called them in the military, in the Air Force, the Air Tasking Order, the ATO. My role was exciting, it was challenging, and it was full of lessons learned. It was quite an experience for me, and trust me, I have a lot of stories I could probably share with you about those days, but there's one in particular that stands out in my memory and I think is kind of apropos to today's conference, and that's what I want to do today. I want to speak directly to you and with you. So I was aboard the USS America, which was an aircraft carrier, and interestingly enough, at the time, it was the oldest carrier in the Navy inventory. It was bound for the Persian Gulf to take over for the USS Abraham Lincoln, which had served its allotted time, providing a Navy presence in the area, and was now on to its next mission or to port or wherever. But my mission in this changing of the guard was to see if we can improve upon a particular issue that had been troubling the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who at the time was General Colin Powell. General Powell did not like the fact that during these changeovers, 2 very high-value assets, the carriers, and over 10,000 sailors, 5,000 or so per carrier, were in very close proximity to each other until the changeover was complete. This is a very rare picture. We have 2 carriers, the Lincoln on top and the America on bottom. Too close for comfort. My team and I had successfully installed the before-mentioned technology. I mentioned the ATO generating technology aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln earlier. And now the chairman of the Joint Chief, General Powell, wanted to know if these newfangled computer systems we were using could, these computer systems we're using to generate the air tasking orders and communicate with all the intelligence and communication systems throughout the theater, if these systems could be used to effectively speed up the transition, if we could use these systems to do these changeovers faster than the historical 2 to 4 days. Now, the general had a lot of smart people at his disposal, I'm sure, right? So I'm sure this question went through a lot of people and a lot of agencies before, it worked its way down the chain and was asked of my boss, right? And we know what happens next, right? He asked my boss, and what does he do? He then asks me, and once he asked the question, chaos followed. We reassigned and redirected and repurposed a lot of people and equipment to see if we could set up a test facility at the United States Military Training Mission in Riyadh to see if we could run a test to answer this question for the general. But we very quickly determined that this wasn't going to be the case. The facility in Riyadh was just not designed for this purpose. A test of this magnitude was just out of its scope. And the only way we were going to answer this question accurately for the general was to test it in the real world. Well, the real world comes with real reactions, right? One of the things I recall were the many different conversations and reactions I had from my peers and coworkers who redirected to assist with the attempt to set up a test facility in Riyadh. I remember hearing things like, why me, And, isn't there someone back stateside who could be working on this issue or is working on this problem? Or I remember one person in particular who was stating that he had orders to go back to the U.S. in 3 weeks, and now he was upset that he was going to spend every bit of that 3 weeks busting his tail on this project. And these are understandable comments, considering a lot of these people have been working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, for 3 to 6 months or longer, because that's the shift in the military. So these responses were understandable. They're typical human reactions to stress. But there were also reactions I saw as atypical. There are many who saw this as an opportunity, and they embraced it. And they were no doubt as frustrated as the rest with the additional work, but it wasn't visible in them. And despite their frustration, they could be overheard saying things like, hey guys, well, I know this is bad, I know we don't understand, but it could be a lot worse, right? Because there's always somebody who has it worse. And although they were tired, they seemed to turn it up a notch. Their enthusiasm seemed to pull everybody along with them. These were superhuman reactions to stress. And sometimes this is who we have to be. But I'm going to get back to the story. The USS America had just set port at Sigonella Navy Base in Sicily. And my boss and many others were scrambling to see how they were going to get my crew, our equipment, and yours truly out to Sicily in time to board the USS America, and then execute a test to see how rapidly we could change over comms. And I should also mention that the test we were going to perform aboard the America to change over comms, and I mentioned the America was the oldest carrier in the United States naval inventory. Well, the USS Abraham Lincoln was the newest aircraft carrier in the inventory. So we were being tasked with taking the oldest carrier and to replace the newest carrier, all right, with a technology system. That's not going to be an issue, right? Okay. Well, after much horse trading and bargaining, my boss had managed to secure space for us on a tanker aircraft that was bound for that region. And I've often laughed. I don't know what he had to promise or who he had to, or what he had to reroute, or what he had to promise or bump out of those seats to ensure our accommodations, but I never really asked because we were Sicily bound. And we arrived safely at Sigonella Navy Air Force Base and boarded the USS America aircraft. There we go. And we boarded via helicopter and we got right to work. So I made several references that the USS America was the oldest carrier in the naval inventory. It was actually commissioned in 1965. And I just want to put things into perspective. In 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson was president. gas was a whopping 31 cents a gallon. And we would take these 31-cent gallons and put them in our brand new cars, which cost on the average of $2,600, for a good one. And then we would take our $2,600 cars and do what's the next best thing? We'd go out and do something. We'd drive to a movie. And the 1965, the hottest movie out was The Sound of Music. So we would have been going to see that premiere. But those of us in IT, we weren't wasting our money or spending our money on fancy new cars, the $2,600 cars, or going to movies. We were probably all at home, trying to impress our friends. Kelly can probably attest to this. We were trying to impress our friends with our knowledge of the latest IT systems, right? So in 1965, we probably would have been working on special code with, programs with the beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code. So that had come out the year before, and we were probably impressing our friends writing programs in that. For those of you who don't recognize it by that name, you may recognize it by its abbreviation, BASIC. And the smallest computer you could buy in '65 was the newly crafted DEC PDP-8, which was about the size of a refrigerator, boasted a whopping 4 kilobytes of memory, and cost $18,000. And just to put things in perspective, 4 kilobytes of memory, it seems absurd today considering the average photo takes 1,000 kilobytes or a meg just to store it. So the next time you find yourself at the Verizon store complaining about the cost of your data plan on your new iPhone, just come back to this story. So needless to say, this installation of state-of-the-art IT systems were neither envisioned nor designed into the original specs of the USS America. So this was sure to be an interesting endeavor. Some of you might be asking, well, then how did the pilots do their jobs? How did they accomplish their jobs prior to the installation of our systems? It's a good question. So prior to the installation of the systems we installed, aircraft carriers received their flight instructions, the ATO, via what we called SneakerNet. Now, SneakerNet was when the closest secure land location would print out a hard copy of the air tasking order, give it to somebody who would then run outside and board an aircraft of some type, helicopter or fixed wing, and then take off, fly out over the water, land on the carrier, and then this person who was presumably wearing sneakers would then jump out of the helicopter or aircraft and run across the flight deck and deliver the hard copy of the air tasking order to the operations officer, who would then distribute it to the pilots. So, I just thought about something. I probably shouldn't even be telling you about this highly technical system of the future. We could probably get in a lot of trouble, so why don't we just keep that to ourselves? But SneakerNet, that's how they did it. And I know I've gone through a lot of detail, but I'm trying to right now help you paint a picture in your minds of the environment in which we were working. Because it was such an old ship and this environment was not designed for this, we had a difficult time finding power for our equipment. We had a difficult time finding space for our equipment, and there was very little available bandwidth for our equipment. For example, the entire aircraft carrier had a grand total of 256K of bandwidth, which we had to share with the other systems aboard the vessel. Now, just to keep in mind that the average household today has about 6 times that amount of bandwidth. So my question to you is, how would you like to run the communications show for an entire aircraft carrier from your living room or maybe your home office? Right? It couldn't have been any worse than the USS America where we were working. It was a difficult deployment, but the lack of technology was not the most difficult element. You see, many of the sailors who we were working with had not been briefed specifically on why we were there. And they didn't appreciate a bunch of flyboys coming into their turf, if you will, coming onto their ship, interfering with their work and requiring babysitting just to get around. So although our system was clearly an improvement, we encountered a lot of resistance from the sailors we were working with. Now, I was frustrated at the time, but now looking back, I can clearly and fully appreciate both sides of the situation. From my perspective, I was just trying to do my job. I was going to bring these guys into the 20th century with the latest state-of-the-art technology and to make their lives easier and help them more efficiently and effectively accomplish their missions. From their perspective, they were just trying to do their job. But I had appeared in their workplace, uninvited, at least uninvited by them, to help them solve a problem that most of them didn't even know they had. I mean, what's wrong with SneakerNet, right? We laugh, but it worked. It worked, and now I can see them now. Why do I need to learn another new IT system? Additionally, if the Navy really had a problem, why did the Navy? I'm not sure if anyone here has ever been visited by a consultant, but it's very similar. Looking back, I even wonder if anyone had ever even taken the time to ask these individuals if they had any ideas or suggestions to improve their situation. Well, despite the conditions and the resistance, we were determined to make this deployment a success as we had earlier on the USS Lincoln. And in order to do that, we had to remain laser focused on making this test a success. General Powell wanted to know how fast we could switch over communications from one carrier to the other. We had 2 days to install and ensure the functionality of our system before the clock started ticking on the actual test. We actually had everything up and going early on day 2. But because we had worked through the night, I told my guys to go on and get some rest so that they could be sharp for the actual test. While they rested, I stood guard over the system to make sure that no curious sailors started messing with our configurations. Now, we've all been in situations where we're responsible for getting something done, whether it was high visibility or not, or whether it was, or whether we caused the problem or not, or whether we were part of the decision process for the proposed corrective action or not. Well, that's where I was. I certainly didn't cause this problem. And like many of the sailors on the ship, before my boss brought me into his office, I didn't fully appreciate the magnitude of this problem or that it was a problem. This was a very visible situation, and no one had asked us if this was a good time for us to run the test. They didn't say, Captain Lewis, are you okay? Is this a good time for you? Nope. And no one had asked either. In addition, no one had asked if I had any recommendations on how we could ensure that this test was a success. But it was very clear, it was crystal clear, that there was a lot of pressure from within the Air Force, assumingly from those who helped design and build this system, that this test be a success. Someone up the chain of command had clearly articulated to their superiors that this system would work on the ship for this purpose. Promises had clearly been made. Perhaps someone even promised the General Powell, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, directly that this system would work on the ship for this purpose. Regardless of how it happened and who promised what, based on the way it came down the chain of command, ultimately to my desk, it was now my job to keep this promise. And if this test did fail, I knew right from the beginning that it was going to reflect poorly on my team and for myself. Not the promise maker. I mean, isn't that how it works? It would be my behind, no one else's. No one would want to hear that the system didn't have adequate power, or that we couldn't find space, or that someone tinkered with this configuration or that configuration, or this didn't work or that didn't work. If this test failed, the after-action report was very certainly going to read that Rich Lewis and his team failed. So I had to take precautions. I stood guard over the system while my people worked, my people rested. A few hours later, it was my turn to take a nap. So we tested the system one more time to make sure everything was still working, and then I went and laid down and took a nap. But my rest was interrupted by my crew and these words: "Captain, Captain, we have a problem." Okay? The system apparently had powered down, and no one really knew why. And we were less than 6 hours from game time. So 6 hours may not sound like a whole lot of time, but we were glad we had built it into our timeline. Glad we had given ourselves a little additional breathing room. Should always plan for the unexpected and expect something to go wrong. So we scrambled a few of the ship's engineers to help us troubleshoot the power outage. About an hour later, the engineers came back and said, okay, we found the problem, but you're not going to believe it. And you know what? They were right. They explained it was an old vessel, and I knew that, and that over the years, many things had been rerouted and re-engineered for various reasons, and sometimes without documentation. I don't know if I should have even mentioned that little detail. I'm sure no one here has ever had a mess to clean up or a task given to them there was no documentation. But that's where we were. The engineers showed us where the power to the outlets where we had set up our equipment had at some time and for some reason been connected to a circuit that was controlled by a light switch in a conference room a few bulkheads down, or down the hall. And apparently someone had turned off the light switch, which in itself isn't a bad thing, right? I mean, every time I walk by a light that's on, I still hear my grandma, turn that light off, you burn up all my electricity, right? So that in itself is not a bad thing, but when this person turned off the light in that conference room, we lost power to our critical communication systems. And all of a sudden, the mission was in jeopardy. Not quite the explanation I was expecting, and I was really struggling in my mind to think, well, who would do that, and why would they do that? And I just had a whole bunch of questions, but you know what? There was no time to whine about it. We're four and a half hours from showtime. I asked the engineers that they were sure this was the only switch on our power that I needed to be concerned about. They assured me that it was. Forgive me if I still had doubts in my mind, so I asked the question again. I asked them if they were absolutely sure that there were no other switches or buttons, and I was a little sarcastic, I'm sorry, but I asked them if they were sure there were no buttons or switches that maybe would cause all the toilets to flush, or maybe the ship to capsize or self-destruct. They didn't think I was very funny, actually, but looking back, it did help at least my team to relax a little bit. So I thought to myself, I'm a captain in the United States Air Force. I'm a college graduate, an Air Force Academy graduate, no less. I can solve this problem. I'm experienced in the latest technologies, and I have a vast engineering background, and I can solve this problem. So mustering all my creative energies, I was doing one of these, and all my engineering background, I came up with a plan. I came up with an idea. And I said I wanted to write down my idea. I wanted to communicate this plan. I asked my guys, bring me a pad and paper. So they ran off and got me that. I talked to the ship's engineers. I said, I need an adhesive of some sort. They brought me tape. Fine, that works, perfect. I then sat down and got to work. I sat down and got to work, and within seconds, I had documented my plan. It was viable, it would work. I got up, I went to the conference room in question, and I taped a note over the light switch that said, "Do not turn off." So at this point, General Colin Powell's question, or the answer to his question, an answer to which would influence national policy on aircraft carrier changeover guidelines and procedures, was dependent upon the effectiveness of this note, and unfortunately, the legibility of my handwriting. And it was actually my concern over the handwriting part that prompted me to add another layer here, and I asked that a guard be put on the door, and they did. But sometimes it's the simple things. I then told my two-person team to test the system again to make sure it was still working. They did. They tested it. Everything worked fine. I said, great, fantastic. Test it again. So now we were ready. Well, after all of this effort to get to Sigonella, get on the carrier, get our equipment set up, find out we didn't have power, figure out what the power issue was, get to our battle stations, if you will, to prepare for the test. I have to say that the test itself was very extremely anticlimactic. Our communication switchover test took less than 4 hours and was a total success. My team and I had done in less than 4 hours what had never been done in less than 2 to 4 days. There we are, that's the team. Now, after all we went through to make this happen, and execute and pass the test the way we did, we were pretty happy. And we kind of thought that celebration was in order. I personally was thinking that a nice bottle of Dom Perignon, maybe a 74 or something of that, era, would have been appropriate. Quickly, no. Well, we had made the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff happy today. He was a happy man, had a smile on his face because of the work we just did. How about at least a nice vintage bottle of wine? No. Grasping at straws at this point, a Bud Light? No. Glass of Kool-Aid and a Jawbreaker? No, not even that. Nothing. I remember thinking to myself, oh man, that's kind of cold. No recognition, no acknowledgement, no appreciation. But very often, that's how it is. Well, that's the slide I was looking for before. It's 1965, everybody. But very often, that's how it is. The only reward we can expect a lot of times as middle management is not to get yelled at, not to get in trouble, and in extreme cases, not to get fired. But don't be discouraged by this. Do not be discouraged. Be proud of the work you do. Our team was proud. We should all be proud. And we should document our successes for ourselves. Document your success for yourselves and for the time that eventually will come when your performance will be officially evaluated. And your supervisor will either ask you to review a write-up that he or she has done on your behalf, or will ask you for input for a write-up that they're going to put together for you. This is when it's absolutely critical, and this is important, it's absolutely critical that you have your accomplishments, the dates of your accomplishments, and the results of your accomplishments available so that you can tell your story the way you want it told and in a way that demonstrates your value. Well, I don't mind saying that my team and I, we had our own little celebration. It started off like this, we high-fived. We just did one of these. Then we took up an invitation we had received to go up to the flight deck and watch flight operations for a while, so we watched some of the planes take off and land. Then we went to dinner, and this is when it got good. Then after dinner, we went back to our rooms and went to sleep and got some rest. That is celebrating military style. So the next day, we were invited to leave the ship. We started collecting and securing our equipment, which we would not be leaving on the ship, and prepared for disembarkation. We were informed that we would be dropped off in a city called Trieste, Italy. And as we left the ship, I reflected on our time on the USS America and really smiled inside, because we had done a good job. I was proud of my team. I was grateful for the opportunity and for the challenge we had just faced and come through. Then I reflected on the past and all the work that had been done to even just to get us to Sigonella in time for the test. And the fact that our boss had the confidence in the abilities and professionalism of my team and myself to even send us on this mission. Sometimes just being in the position itself is affirmation of one's good work. Then I reflected on the reality of the present. Oh my goodness. We are in Trieste, Italy, with no plan for getting back to Saudi Arabia. I think this reality must have hit my guys the same time it hit me, because it was at this exact moment that my tech sergeant looked up at me and said, "Okay, what are we going to do now, Captain?" And I can still hear his words today in my mind, especially when confronted with some kind of adversity, because I had very little contact with my boss while on the USS America because of the limited bandwidth, and I had even less communication now that we were off the ship. This was the pre-cell phone era, so I couldn't just call him on his mobile. Our office in Saudi Arabia was on a military network, which is completely separate from commercial lines, so I had no idea how to call from a payphone to our office, especially when the operator only spoke Italian. We were in somewhat of a difficult situation. I was in charge, and we were completely on our own. But again, no time to whine about it, I thought to myself, and I didn't want to scare my guys. I didn't want to scare my troops. But this was a very defining moment for me. Maybe even more so than the test itself. You see, because when it comes to computers, I had a really good general understanding of computers. That was my background. That was my undergraduate. That's what I had done in the military. And this system in particular, I had an intimate understanding of because I had helped design the system. I had written parts of the code. I had installed it at various bases, and I had a all-star, super smart team with me in case we ran into anything unexpected. I had the authority of my own rank, and I had the written directive of a 5-star general to back me up. But on this random dock, on this random day in southern Italy, I felt very alone. My authorities meant nothing. All of my education and training was inapplicable. I had no way to reach my boss, and I couldn't even read the street signs or speak the language. But as I said earlier, I was in charge, and I was the highest authority on my team. This was my call to action, and I now had to lead. In that instant, though, I realized I had everything I needed to get our team safely back to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I knew we were in southern Italy, okay? And I knew that Aviano Air Force Base was in northern Italy. So all we needed to do was get to a train station. I knew some Spanish, which is similar to Italian in some ways. And I was able to stutter and stammer my way to a train station. I only wish we had Rosetta Stone back then. So once we got to this train station, I knew we could get to northern Italy. Once we got to northern Italy, I knew we could get to Aviano Air Force Base. Once we got to Aviano Air Force Base, I knew we could get help to an airport. Once we got to an airport, I knew we could get to Rhine-Main. Once we got to, or we could get to Frankfurt. Once we got to Frankfurt, I knew we could get to Rhine-Main Air Force Base, which was a hub for multiple theaters. So I knew if we could get to Rhine-Main, we could get back to Saudi Arabia. Piece of cake, right? It's a nice plan. It worked. It took 3 days, but it worked. And now we were safely back to the war zone. So, in general, I know we've gone down a voyage down memory lane, and I thank you for sharing with me this time and for joining me on this voyage, but I don't want you to see it as just me holding all of you hostage and forcing you to listen to one of my old war stories. As I mentioned, mentioned earlier, I've worked in corporate America for a while. I have my own company. I'm an entrepreneur. But I chose this particular story because I stated earlier, I think it's particularly relevant to the challenges we face as managers, because we are where the rubber hits the road. We are the critical intersection, and I think Esther even alluded to this, where executive management and entry-level employees, interns, college grads, and junior managers meet. When the general had a question, he did have a lot of people at his disposal, and that question got routed through many of those people and many of those agencies till it finally ended up on the desk of a manager to get an answer to that question and to get the job done. And I'm sure many of you are in similar circumstance. Managers speak the languages of executives and the entry-level employees and are the bridge to clear communications and goals and objectives for both. Great managers are aware of the frustration some top-down directives can cause, but they possess the superhuman reactions we discussed earlier to provide calmness and positivity and set the example that motivates everyone to accomplish the most difficult and sometimes even impossible task. Great managers are grounded. As I just stated, they often anticipate where a particular corporate direction might encounter resistance from those responsible for the execution, and they will either work with the executive team or with the workforce or both to find an optimum solution and still accomplish the job with all employees on board. Finally, because it is imperative to any organization to recognize and promote great managers, to higher level leaders and executives, managers must document what they do. I stated this earlier and I say it again. We need to document what we see as success, our successes, our lessons learned, and our results. And many of us tend to shy away from patting ourselves on the back. And we certainly don't feel comfortable very often expressing our success to our managers. But we should. The day will come when you're asked to talk about those successes. Maybe it's in a review or an interview, and it's important to know what you have achieved. So to assist all of you with the journaling of all of your fantastic and wonderful success, my company, RTL Networks, wants you to have this notebook, which I'm not sure where they are, but I'm going to ask that they start maybe passing them out, which will assist each of you in reminding yourselves what amazing, truly amazing, and resourceful managers all of you are. That concludes my formal remarks. I'm not sure if anyone has any questions. I just thank you for the opportunity to come and present to you.
So I think as they're passing out the notebooks, if you have any questions, Mr. Lewis is kind enough to stick around for questions. So we have a couple of microphones around the room. So if you have a question, we'll come to you with a microphone. Oh, perfect.
That was a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that. You know, one of the things as managers, and you alluded to it a little bit, is sometimes we have to work with people whom we really don't have authority over. And so when you landed on that carrier, you know, you were with the Navy, and possibly they didn't recognize maybe your rank. Can you talk kind of how you navigated those waters of working with people whom you did not have direct authority over?
Absolutely.
Or who viewed you as an outsider?
I was very much an outsider, and you're absolutely right. Even scrambling the ship's engineers was a lot more difficult than as I just stated. And usually there's some level of authority. There's some doctrine or practice or statute where you have some authority. Now, whether the authority is structural, or it's just on paper, or whether you're the expert, usually there's some area of authority, and that's what we attempted to leverage. Certainly we used the written directive of the 5-star general, and there was some authority there, and there were some people on the ship who were familiar with why we were there, so we went to leverage them. The people hadn't been briefed, so we would go out to the people who did kind of know what was going on and ask them to basically pull everyone together, sit in a room, and have that person who had the trust and authority over the people introduce us more formally and tell them why we were here and what it was we were to accomplish and what was expected of them. And then, you know, beyond that, you know, again, we would foot stomp on the fact that this is a test that's coming from the chairman or joint chief of staff, and that, you know, so we bringing everybody on board. Now, you can brute force and force them to do it through rank or directives, or like I said earlier, we bring them into a room, we have someone who they trust, who's familiar with what's going on, leveraging that trust and that authority to kind of get everybody on the same page. Hope that answers the question. It's one method. And
I was just curious if your work at RTL Networks works together with what you do here at the Fed, or how it ties in. How your work at RTL ties in with what you do for the Fed?
My work at RTL, I really didn't go too much into that, but RTL Networks is an IT sales and solutions firm. We sell network infrastructure equipment, routing, switching, firewall, voice over IP, storage. We provide the hardware that allows the internet to work. We keep information secure. We also work phone systems and storage, and we provide the services around it. So we don't just sell the equipment. We can install, troubleshoot, design, architect, and do operations for a lot of that equipment. We work a lot with the government, Department of Defense, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Air Force probably being our largest client, and then a lot with federal agencies, Department of Agriculture, Department of Interior, EPA, things of that nature. We also do some energy. We've been working with the Department of Energy for probably 7 years now, so we also have a division that sells high voltage power distribution systems and services. As far as work with the Fed, I'm able to leverage some of that entrepreneurial experience as far as to communicate to those who are trying to set monetary policy around what is it like for entrepreneurs starting a company today. What trends are going on in the IT industry? What does that mean for employment? What does that mean for economic development in the region? And even outside of IT, what are some of the other things that we're seeing? You know, where is some of our work coming from? Well, we're seeing a lot of work in transportation, or this sector, this vertical, or that vertical. So we're able to communicate a lot of that as board members to the branch and through the Kansas City Bank, to help Esther and company and all of you with information that's needed for, because you have all the data you could ever need here at the Fed. You have more data than I'll ever see in a lifetime. But sometimes it's interpreting that data. What does it mean? You know, and sometimes we like to believe that we can help with that interpretation. Well, with that, I thank you.